Okay, and I will take the water, just in case. So, yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me.
Love having you.
Already, I've only been here for a month, and they already love me. What a great place to be. So yes, I am working on a book, and when I was thinking about this presentation today, I was again, thinking how I should present this book in 30 minutes, because I don't know, I was told I have 30 minutes. Do I have 30 minutes? And also make it accessible to the audience that might not be particularly interested in the Soviet Union. So I would only talk about one aspect of the book, one chapter, just to give you an idea of what the book is about. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because, it's a conscious decision. I don't have any visuals, unfortunately. I don't have any quotes today, so you'll just have to bear with me. Before I move on, I just want to give you a brief idea of the historiographical debates I see myself in. The first one is the general debate about domestic service. And domestic service is extremely popular among scholars among sociologists, historians, anthropologists, because it lends itself very well to exploring all kinds of inequalities, gender inequality, class inequality, racial inequalities, any inequality, it's there. And the literature is very diverse, but what most of these writings have in common is that when they talk about domestic service in the modern world, it's being analyzed and critiqued, particularly the inequalities and exploitation that is usually associated with domestic service. It is usually seen as the product of capitalism and the market. And when you listen to this critique of capitalism and exploitation in domestic service, you often assume that what is the alternative? And the alternative is often socialism. Moreover, a lot of researchers that work in domestic service are thinking about different policy solutions that will improve the lot of domestic workers. And again, when we think about these policies, we don't really know what happens when these policies are enacted. And one of those examples is the Soviet Union, which so far hasn't really been studied. What happens to domestic service under socialism? So this is one of the conversations. The second conversation is, of course, the conversation about the Soviet Union and inequalities within the Soviet system. Again, the fact that domestic servants existed in the Soviet Union is known to historians. But most historians believe that domestic service was something secret, something that happened behind closed doors of upper class apartments. As I will show, it wasn't so. In fact, domestic service was discussed on the pages of popular magazines, in meetings. Domestic workers were ubiquitous in Soviet fiction and film. So it wasn't a secret, as we usually think about it. Another common kind of feature of this historiography is that when it talks about domestic service, it talks about domestic service in the 1930s, domestic service under Stalin. And it is usually part of the conversation about the great retreat from the revolutionary values under Stalin, or the betrayal of the revolution, as Leon Trotsky put it. Or if you're a historian of gender, this is the time of the conservative term, which is very different from what happened before, during the first decade after the revolution in the 1920s. So what I argue is that this betrayal of the revolution was in fact part and parcel of Bolshevik ideology from the very beginning. As I will show, the economic challenges were, of course, important in normalizing domestic labor, but the hierarchy of labor that was embedded in Soviet ideology from the very beginning was what made it possible. So, for the rest of my time, I will talk about a history of a particular law, one piece of legislation, the law on the working conditions of workers hired to fulfill housework and personal service for the employer and his immediate family, enacted in February of 1926, so 9 years after the revolution of 1917. So I argue that this law that actually denied domestic workers a lot of the rights that other workers in the Soviet Union had was a manifestation of the gendered hierarchy of labor that recognized the necessity of housework, but prioritized productive labor outside the home over reproductive, or as they said, unproductive labor within the home. It was also a manifestation of the Soviet rationality when collective needs were prioritized over needs of the individual or a certain group of workers. And it was also a product of a gendered vision of a society in which housework was women's work. So the story begins in 1918 when the Bolsheviks enacted their first labor code. The code was to apply to all laborers. It made no exceptions for people working in private household. The next code that was enacted only 4 years later, in 1922, also made no exceptions for domestic workers. Just like any other laborers, domestic workers were entitled to an 8-hour workday, labor contract, weekends, a paid vacation. So all this, all this package that the Soviet state bestowed on the workers. Domestic workers had to receive salaries based on official wage scale. Their employers were supposed to pay insurance premiums for hiring servants. In case a domestic worker lost her job, she could apply for unemployment benefits. So basically, this legislation was built on the assumption that domestic workers were just like any other workers in the worker state. Moreover, the word servant, the pre-revolutionary word servant or прислуга, was replaced with the word домработница, domestic worker, to emphasize again that these are workers in a worker state. Yet the attitude towards the practice of hiring domestic servants or workers remained quite ambiguous. So for those of you that are not very familiar with the history of the Soviet Union, so when the Bolsheviks came to power, very quickly they ended up fighting a civil war. And even though they won, the economy was devastated, and Lenin enacted what is known as the new economic policy. So the partial reintroduction of market relationship that included private employment of workers, appearance of a class of nepmen, the small businessmen. So this policy that was supposed to help economy recover was also considered as a step back by some of the Bolsheviks. So this practice of hiring service for many people in the Bolshevik elite seemed like one of those ugly faces of the new economic policy. Soviet newspapers and magazines were full of stories of domestic workers being exploited, abused, denied equal rest and pay. As the Central Party newspaper Pravda wrote, now all those who are not used to working themselves are hiring maids. Domestic workers themselves were described as the most exploited, the most backward kinds of workers, and therefore they were particularly entitled to receive support and help from the Soviet state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The state watchdog overseeing employers' compliance with the labor code was the Professional Union of People's Food Service and Dormitory Workers, NARPIT. And NARPIT is the only Russian word I want you to remember for today. It's the union, NARPIT. NARPIT was one of the numerous unions that was originally a labor union, but then lost its independence and became a state labor union that was mostly acting in the name of the workers, but in fact in the name of the Soviet state. So in case there was a conflict between a domestic worker and the employer, the domestic worker was supposed to go to the union and have a hearing with the union's Rates and Disputes Commission. Materials from Leningrad, NARPID's Rates and Dispute Commission show that the members understood relationship between the employer and the domestic worker in class terms. While ideally the Rates and Disputes Commissions were supposed to serve as a neutral body that would mediate and resolve the conflict, in fact, these activists saw themselves as protecting the rights of the worker. Since in most cases when there's a conflict between a domestic worker and an employer, there was very little evidence to support anything. If there was overtime or who paid whom, the Rates and Dispute Commission would always privilege the word of the domestic worker. Moreover, they understood domestic service as an inherently exploitative institution. That's why it was their job to be on the side of the domestic worker. I don't really have time to talk about individual cases, but you have to trust me that most of them were resolved in domestic workers' favor. The committee rarely asked for any evidence and usually granted whatever the domestic worker asked for. Moreover, NARPID, the union, assumed that treating domestic workers as other workers was not enough. Because they were the most backwards, the most exploited, they should get more from the state. And therefore, they decided to draft a new law that would give domestic workers even more protection by the state. And to have a law passed, of course, you cannot just have a union draw a piece of legislation. You had a meeting of different state authorities, the women's section of the party, the all-union commissariat. So when the union came and proposed the law, what they had was a very pro-worker, pro-domestic worker piece of legislation. In addition to reiterating to all the rights that domestic workers had according to the labor code, they made additional amendments. For example, the law contained a special clause that mandated the employer to treat domestic worker with respect, but not the other way around, and give the worker the same food as other family members. This clause reproduced the pre-revolutionary Soviet organization demands for respect, and it hints on this understanding of domestic service as inherently exploitative institution. The employers were by default to exploit the domestic worker. That's why the domestic worker had to be protected, but not the other way around. Yet the discussion with other members of this big state committee revealed that this additional support for domestic workers was no longer the party line. The attack on the proposal came from the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions, and its chair, Mikhail Tomsky, criticized the stupid clause, for example, that guaranteed food of the same quality for domestics as food of their employees, stating that servants don't need to eat truffles or kosher food. Tomsky also suggested that employers were given the right to demand medical examination of their workers, but of course not the other way around. And when talking about this law, Tomsky often spoke in the first person. For instance, when criticizing the clause that the NARPID proposed that gave a pregnant domestic worker the right to stay in the apartment of the employer for 5 months, the last 2 months of pregnancy, and then 2 months after the baby comes, and then 1 more month. Tomsky said, within 5 months, I will have 5 pregnant servants who will show up with their babies. So even though Tomsky was the chair of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions, a serious union activist, in this situation, he was on the side of the employer. The heaviest blow came was the new regulation of the working hours. So according to the law that the committee actually approved, the number of the working hours a week was limited to 192 days, which was normal, right, as any other workers. But the hours could be distributed throughout the week as the employers saw fit. Moreover, the law did not guarantee pay for overtime work. So what happened was a domestic worker could basically work throughout the day. There was no way of receiving overtime pay. Most importantly, the labor contract was now deemed optional. Why is that important? Is that because if it's a signed contract registered with the union, breaking the labor conflict was a criminal offense. But if you don't have a labor contract and you violate the oral agreement or whatever you had, you cannot use it in court. So as a result, domestic workers could easily end up paying for much more than 192 hours a week without extra compensation. And this really, this gross contradiction between having a limit of hours to work and not having any compensation for overpay was never discussed. Those debates about the law were also accompanied by the discussion of the deviations in the work of the Rates and Disputes Committees. As one of the contributors to the union newspaper noted, the aggressive style of those committees drove away employers who wouldn't come to the mediation sessions. Another worker correspondent complained that most domestic workers misunderstood the purpose of rates and disputes commissions and saw them as mechanisms that would help the worker get whatever she wanted rather than a tool that would facilitate reaching an agreement. NARPE defended its position, saying that we need to protect the right of the domestic worker, otherwise they're not going to come to the union. And without bringing them to the union, we will never transform them from backward domestic servants into conscious domestic workers. And we're not going to collect the union fees, and the union is not going to function. But NARPE's arguments fell on deaf ears, and the law of 1926 created separate committees under the auspices of the People's Commissariat of Labor. The representatives of the union could still participate, but as a consultant to the domestic workers. So basically, the union was demoted from being the judge to being the lawyer. This law on domestic service was one of several laws introduced in 1925 and 1926. All of them were tailored to the needs of specific groups of workers that were deemed too different from other workers and needed some sort of special legislation, such as agricultural workers or seasonal workers or domestic workers. Although all these were more or less worsened the position of these special groups of workers, domestic workers were in the worst position to compare to them all. Even agricultural workers that were also privately employed in the homes in the countryside received money for overtime work. How do we explain this injustice to domestic workers? Well, the first explanation is obviously socioeconomical. The laws were meant to provide some protections for workers while lessening the pressure on the employer in times of very high unemployment. So the 1920s were the time of very high unemployment, but unemployment affected men and women differently because women were believed to be backward, less qualified. They were often the last ones to be hired and the first ones to be fired. And the attempts to kind of bridle the employers of domestic workers only led to employers not wanting to hire a unionized maid and just hiring a new girl from the village. According to NARPE statistics, as of October 1st, 1926, almost 25 of domestic workers registered with the union were unemployed. So basically a quarter of all unionized domestics were unemployed. So it seems that the rights of the individual domestics were to be sacrificed for the needs of domestic workers as a group. So you can't come and complain and get whatever you want because it's going to jeopardize everybody else, all the other domestic workers. But meeting the needs of domestic workers as a group was not the end goal of the law. Rather than defending the narrow interest of domestic workers as a group, the Soviet system of labor management, which included labor laws and unions, was first and foremost to ensure the growth of Soviet economy. Only with a sufficient material base can you start building a socialist state. Initially, domestic workers appeared to be irrelevant to the goal of building socialism. How could a maid working in a private home contribute to the building of socialism? However, by the mid-1920s, it became clear that maids indeed had something to do with building socialism. By that time, the union conducted research, and it turned out that the majority of employers were, in fact, workers or white-collar workers. For example, in Moscow, 77.8% of employers were white-collar workers and 7.5% were blue-collar workers. As one of the brochures published after the introduction of the law argued, the Soviet master is not a barin. Barin is a term used to address the master before the revolution. So the Soviet master is not a barin that used to hire maids. Most employers in the Soviet Union are workers whose wives work at factories and have no one to look after children. Soviet white-collar workers whose wives also work somewhere. Families of public servants, union and party activists, in which husbands and wives run around all day attending meetings in addition to their jobs, and the responsibility of raising the children and running the household lies mostly on the shoulders of the domestic worker, single women that are busy with their jobs, and women with children. The number of nepmen that hire servants is quite small, and the law is intended not for them, but first and foremost for the categories of toilers listed above, who are not the wealthy and hire domestic workers out of need, not out of idleness. So this passage explicitly states that the needs of employers were the primary reasons why this law was introduced. Satisfying the needs of employers, in turn, was in the best interest of the state. Domestic workers were needed by the Soviet economy to free the labor of the more qualified employers so they could participate in building socialism in the factory or in their office. The passage also reiterated that housework was women's responsibility. Only those families in which women were also involved in productive labor outside the home were deemed to have the right to have maids. Of course, Bolsheviks, like good Marxists, believed that the final solution of housework will be socializing and rationalizing domestic work, building public cafeterias, laundromats, building creches. Creation of this public service industry would solve two issues. The first one was the question of domestic workers' participation in building socialism. Relieved of their duties in the home, domestic workers could finally work in the factory or work on themselves and get education and become engaged builders of socialism. That was fundamental for the project itself. The second benefit of transferring housekeeping tasks to public industry was that it was simply more efficient. The Bolsheviks believed that professionals working at laundry facilities, cafeterias, and kindergarten would simply do a better job of cooking, doing the dishes, and raising children. And it was simply impossible to rationally organize domestic labor within the individual home the same way that it could be organized in a, say, factory kitchen. The two goals of creating a public service industry reflected the tension between the promise of individual self-realization through labor and imperative to build socialism. The building of socialism required organized labor in the way that would allow for the most efficient production of material wealth. Taking into account the objective differences in people's abilities, or the fact that someone is a little backward right now and the other person is more conscious, implied that division of labor that was in fact necessary. Marxists saw collectivization of housework outside the home as the most efficient solution to the problem of housework. At the same time, the centrality of efficiency in socialist labor organization meant that potentially domestic labor could be organized some different way if deemed necessary. So under the economic pressures of the post-Civil War society, the Soviet state chose to invest its limited resources in something that they felt was more important for the project of building socialism and production. Investing money into public service facilities would, in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, benefit women first and foremost. This gendered view of domestic labor came into conflict with the state's need for the labor of some of professionally or ideologically trained women. That was particularly true when talking about families of the Bolsheviks that tended to marry within their intelligentsia circles, and in those families, most often than not, both the man and the wife were engaged in some sort of productive labor. Hiring a nanny or a maid became widespread and acceptable solution for these families. So the law of 1926 makes sure that the most valuable toilers could exercise their privilege of not having to do housework. A year after this law was introduced, the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions commissioned a secret report on its effects. Well, the secret report contained some discouraging news. The number of labor agreements plummeted. In general, as the report argued, the law paved the way for unbridled exploitation of domestic workers. The courts of conciliation that replaced rates and disputes commissions chose the tactic of giving domestic workers some money, but not what they asked for, because as they often argued now, there was no evidence to support the domestic workers' claim. So clearly, the domestic workers were worse off. However, I want to emphasize that this high number of complaints in the courts is also indicative of the fact that domestic workers did go and complain, that this law gave them the sense that they were entitled of some sort of protection by the Soviet state. To sum up, the history of domestic service in the early Soviet period is a story of how the failure to address gender hierarchies undermined the efforts to build class equality. Historians have convincingly argued how the Bolsheviks actually failed to free women, and the history of domestic service is part of the story. But again, I want to emphasize that what I try to argue is that this obliviousness to gender inequality actually resulted in creating class inequality. Existence of domestic labor in the Soviet Union did rest on class privilege. Most domestic workers were peasant migrants working from middle class or upper class families. However, it was gender inequality that enabled those families to realize their privilege by hiring a maid without undermining their status as honorable Soviet citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Alissa. Yes, please.
My name is Sergey. I'm from the East Asian Studies Department. And first of all, in my opinion, the most famous housekeeper in Soviet Union was housekeeper of Joseph Stalin, Valentina Istomina. She was his housekeeper from 1945 till his death, over many years. And she originally came from a village, and later she was employed by Stalin. Some of his security staff found her for him. And my question, this woman came from the village and working in the factory. So I want to, first of all, to ask, what kind of what group of population did the housekeepers represent? What was it the possibility to come from the village to live in the big cities of Soviet Union? Because as everyone knows, there was no equality in Soviet Union. The life in the villages was much very poor in comparison to the life in the cities. And I want to look at on the legislation from another side. If Stalin and all the big party leaders had housekeepers, so they were interested to do this legislation and have housekeepers at their home because they needed them. It was kind of prestige and.
Okay, first of all, I should have taken a pen. If I forget about something, please remind me. First, your comment about Istomin being the most famous housekeeper.
Yes, and what group of population, is there statistics?
Yeah.
Who was this people, housekeepers? And the second question is, I just look this on this legislation from on another side. That it was legislated by people, by party leaders, but they're interested to have housekeepers.
Party leaders wanted housekeepers.
Okay, talking about this Istomin, of course, at that time, nobody knew about her. It's not like Pravda wrote about Stalin and his housekeeper. We know about her now, and we know about this nannies and maids in his home from, for example, from the memoirs of his daughter, who actually argues that originally they did have all these peasant women, and then in mid-1930s they were all replaced by the newcomers hired through secret services. So basically there were two different terms, prisluga and obsluga. So if you're at this level that Stalin was, they were not just random ladies from the countryside. They were, of course, vetted through a more serious process. Talking about the social composition of domestic service. According to statistics, in the 1920s as well, in the 1930s, there were about 500,000 women officially working in domestic service. This is the census data. How accurate it is, I mean, at least 500,000 women. Most of them came from the villages. That's true. Most of them were women looking for jobs in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and additional impetus was to get a passport because people working on collective farms didn't have passport and the freedom to move around the country. A significant segment of these domestic workers were former people, former nuns, former royal ladies who had no other way of supporting themselves in the new society, and then an old noble lady would be teaching manners to the children of a good communist. As for your second question was that the reason that they had domestic workers is that the elites wanted them. I agree, but I think you're implying that was because they were just duplicitous, and they claim that they're building a state where everyone will be equal, but for themselves they actually kept servants. And I think this is the argument that initially Trotsky is making, and I don't know, Timashov and all the other historians of the Great Retreat.
They had shops for themselves. They lived different life from the rest of society.
Right, but why did they have that? Just because they were jerks, or because this is what building socialism required? You need to stimulate those who perform the most valuable labor for the state in a certain way. So it makes more sense to have a family. So, I'm sorry? It makes more sense to have a family of highly qualified individuals working in the factory, and then a backward lady doing their dishes. It's better for the socialist project. And in fact, in the 1930s, there was this call to provide better care for better domestic care by domestic servants for better workers, for shop workers in the factory, for example.
Yes. Please. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, how much did it cost to have a servant? And also, if the servant had any kind of power to negotiate about it, if it was a private negotiations contract. And I also have a comment about it, meaning that, like, if you look at national policies in the 20s, you see the same thing. So basically, communism is against nationality, but during the 20s, they use national policy to build socialism. So.
It's a tactic.
Yeah, it's a tactic. It's not only about the servants. It's about like a lot of things that you would consider as anti-communist. Actually, they're not.
As we would collect one or two more questions. Just coming from out of the subject.
There's one in the back.
Thank you. First of all, I'm studying Zionism, so it's a very similar purpose to study very similar tension in Zionism in the same years. To be referenced. It's in a readable language, in English.
Ah, okay. Always good.
Second one, you said it's this you talked about. You talked about the first chapter of the book. Can you tell us what the rest of the chapters are about?
Oh, the rest of the chat about the book? Okay, sure.
Okay, one last question. David, you didn't ask anything.
Thank you, Alissa, for a very stimulating talk. I was wondering about the afterlife of these domestic workers. On a kind of personal level, what happens? Can they retire? Do they work until they drop dead? You know? I mean, and are they kind of caught in this cycle? Can they escape? Are there cases when they're able to transition to socialism? And then also on a larger scale, what is the afterlife of domestic service in the Soviet Union in the 50s, 60s, 70s? What's the trend? Do we still have it? Does it, trickle down to almost non-existent? Or
Those I stopped you in the tracks, so please. Yes.
Yes, it's very, very, I think, up-to-date project even for current societies. Yes. And my question was maybe a bit in the direction of personal lives. Like if they were so important for the role of being nannies for these elite people, did the government also foresee for them socialism spirit trainings? Let's say, was they also programmed in the spirit that their children will be singing the same songs, etc.? Yes, and where they were living, was they living with their parents together, or they had to go to the, I'm interested in this, thing.
Thank you. We have no more time, so please.
All right. Okay. I will try to respond to all of these together. Okay. Maybe I'll start with the book, and then I will.
You can do whatever
Yeah.
you want. You don't have to answer all the questions. Answer whatever you have. We have about, say, 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Perfect. Okay. So the idea of the book is actually to show how this tension between class and gender plays out in different aspects of domestic work. So this was about about legislation and cases. Or the next chapter is actually about what you asked, how to turn domestic servants into workers, how to combat their lackey psyche, as they believe to have a different kind of self, and become conscious workers. And there were special educational programs for domestic workers. But the book develops chronologically, and it moves from the prologue is in the pre-revolutionary period, and it goes all the way to the 1980s, because the last law on domestic service was the second and the last law on domestic service was passed in the 1980s during Perestroika. And it shows how different, the chapters show how different circumstances pushed the leadership to change their approaches to domestic labor. For example, when in the early 1930s, we have the 5-year plans, and there are not enough workers to work in the factory. Domestic workers are mobilized into factories, and in fact, it was initially announced that there will be no domestic service anymore. We're building a factory kitchen. But only a few years later, there is a return to older policy that, in fact, domestic service isn't as an essential part of socialist economy, because domestic workers are responsible for providing proper rest for the shop workers in the factory. So, and then it goes again after Stalin dies. There is a debate again about domestic workers service. Why do we have it? Why do we have healthy girls walking other people's dogs instead of working in the factory? And it seems like there is the same conversation over and over and over again, but they never seem to find a way out of it because of those initial contradictions that are there. And I end again with, and chronologically, there is a stable number, I think, of domestic workers throughout the 20s, 30s, and into the 50s. But in the 60s, the situation changes, first of all, because of the demographic situation changes. There are not enough hands, basically, and then it's easier for women to find employment elsewhere. There are more household appliances. Pretty much the same reasons why domestic labor seemed to be dying in the West, but actually didn't. And what we witness now is a grand return of domestic service everywhere, particularly with the collapse of the welfare state. So that's why, again, it's as you said, it's a topic about today as well. About the afterlife. So where they were living, most of the domestic workers were live-in domestics because there was an acute housing crisis in the Soviet Union. So they lived in kitchens, in the same rooms with the family, wherever, in the bathtub. That was... what happened to them later? That's a good question because it's, again, a question of equality and who gets what in the socialist state. Ideally, they were supposed to have the same rights as other workers. For example, when Khrushchev introduced universal pension for urban dwellers, the domestic worker, so the pension was calculated based on your income. And the problem was domestic workers who had been living in the same families for decades would show up with their employers and say, oh, this is how much money we made. And you have to calculate the pension based on this money. And in fact, there was no way of proving whether it did and it didn't. What are we doing? What are we going to do with these domestic workers? They're claiming so much pension. But at the same time, it was difficult for them because you have to have someone who can prove that you have been working for so many years. And if you didn't have this great relationship with one family, it was quite problematic. So some of them, I've interviewed people who did have that, who retired, who would get a separate room from the state as a pensioner, but then others ended up with nothing. How much they actually made? That's a good question because it's, given numbers wouldn't make sense because the numbers change over time. And also assessing how much they really needed compared to what they got, because they got, ideally free food and free housing. The Soviet society was very poor. So there was a hierarchy, but it was a hierarchy in poverty, pretty much. So very often they got a little bit of cash, but in many times it was just a dress or boots or things like that, although they were required by law to be paid in cash, but that didn't often happen. And as for power to negotiate, of course you can always leave and find a better employer. But there was, again, part of the story in the 1920s, there was an idea to develop a wage scale for domestic service, just like there was a wage scale for all the other workers. And there were, I think, 7 different gradations. What you're a nanny, or housemaid or whatever. But then by the mid-1920s, they gave up on that because there was no way of calculating qualifications of domestic worker and how much work she performed. Is there anything else I forgot? No?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.